I'm Sarada. I am a speechwriter. I used to be a speechwriter for President Obama, and now I write for a whole bunch of different people.
My name's David. I also used to be a speechwriter for President Obama. I work for Funny or Die these days, and I wrote a book called Thanks Obama, and also we're friends in real life.
True story.
Yeah. Oh, and we're going to talk to you about stump speeches. So I think the most important thing to know about stump speeches is that the phrase stump speeches is entirely misleading. It's really just a piece of political jargon. A stump speech is just another way of saying, how do you tell your story in a way that gets people to do what you want? How do you get them to join your team?
And whether you're running for state or local office or national office, wherever you go, people are going to want to know, why are you running? And you need to have a good answer for that. And so when we think stump speech, we think 20-minute fancy speech up in front of a podium, but that's not really what we're here to talk about. You can give one of those, but the messaging architecture we want to talk to you about creating will help you write your Facebook posts, and it will help you talk to somebody in a living room. It'll help you do all the different conversations that you need to have when you're running for office.
And one quick note, we both worked for Barack Obama. Spoiler alert, he is a very good speaker. You do not need to speak like Barack Obama in order to use the same ideas that he used to get his message across and to make the kind of arguments that he made.
In fact, it's important to remember that you are not trying to sound like somebody else who's a great speaker. You want to sound like the best version of yourself, and you want to play to your own strengths. And so we're going to talk about how you can use the tools that we're going to offer you to make them work for you and not make you sound like someone else.
Which is Sarada's way of saying she doesn't want to do her Obama impression on camera.
It's really very bad. So it really depends on your race, but you are likely to be having, more often than big speeches in front of large audiences, smaller conversations. Maybe it's a living room chat with potential people who could donate to you. Maybe it's going in front of your local book club and talking about why you're running and getting folks to sign up. And then there's also the non-speaking pieces of this, which are things like Facebook posts and maybe an op-ed in your local paper. And so the message should ultimately be the same in whatever space you're in, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But it is, probably a combination of maybe the occasional big speech with more smaller conversations. It could be one-on-one, it could be a small group, it could be a larger group.
Yeah, I mean, I started in politics actually as a field organizer for Obama in the 2008 campaign, and they taught us to tell our stories. They didn't say write a stump speech, but basically they taught us how to tell your story and then make an ask. And it turns out that asking people for stuff, if you're a candidate, is just called giving a speech. But that's something we went over again and again. And one time, I did have to introduce Joe Biden at a rally, and it was nice that I already knew how to tell my story. So as a local candidate, maybe you do end up getting mixed in with a bigger rally, or you get invited to do something bigger. This will also prepare you for that moment, as well as all those little conversations that add up and get you volunteers and get you voters and donors and all the other things you need.
It can be helpful to use a structure to help you dive into a speech and figure out how to write it, and it gives you a roadmap. And so we're going to offer you a roadmap, and it's called Monroe's Motivated Sequence. We don't know who Monroe is.
No idea.
No idea. But this is a really helpful tool. It's basically a 5-point checklist, and you can use it to kind of structure your speech and make sure that you've got all the necessary elements to create a persuasive stump.
The first thing to start with is context. And context in this case is introducing yourself and explaining what in life led you to this point. You don't have to tell your whole life story, but you do need a couple of details that are going to make people feel like they understand who you are and start to think about, okay, this is probably why this person is running.
So maybe it's worth giving you an example. Let's just say you are running for school board in your town. And so maybe your context is simply, I grew up in this town, I moved away, I came back, and now I've got 3 kids in the school system. I grew up in these schools, and I'm running for school board because I'm deeply invested in these schools, and I think that we can make them better.
And it can really be that simple. I think people overcomplicate it. If you want to take things to the next level, the one piece of advice I would offer is add a couple of details. You don't need tons of details, but if you've got these kids, what are their names? If one of them came home and said something about, I was in school and I was supposed to learn math, and instead we just watched, whatever, DuckTales on VHS. I'm dating myself. But if that's what happened, A, that's a little bit strange, but B, say that. leave some sort of detail that gives the audience a sense that they know you, not just kind of that you're a generic person running, but that you're a specific individual as well. But if you don't do any of that, you're still going to be fine.
First point was context. Second point is need, really the problem. So why are you running? What problem do you want to solve? Like David said, is it because your kid came home and said that he was watching DuckTales in math class instead of learning math? Is it because you think that your school district needs a new capital program and you got involved and you got excited to get involved in that? Whatever the problem is that you want to solve, you want to state that in the second.
And I would say in a speech like the one that you're going to give, or a Facebook post or whatever, that problem section, in the context you've established how it relates to you. These are your kids. You're worried they're not getting a good enough education, for example, in our one analogy here. But in the problem part of your speech, you want to expand that out and explain why everybody is going through that. So that could be a moment when you say, okay, I had this moment when my kid came home, I realized they weren't getting educated in the way that they wanted, and that's a reminder that the school system in general is failing our kids. You want, at the problem point, it should be a problem that you have, but also a problem that people in the audience have. So that's the first chance to really connect the two of you, connect your story with their story.
That's actually what David just said about sort of connecting your story to the broader story is kind of a thread you want to pull through your entire speech. The whole point of this is to demonstrate that you are from this community and you are of these people, and that what you are doing is trying to represent their interests in the office that you're seeking. And so this is kind of planting the seed for that, and then you'll start to build it out.
Yeah. So number 3, so we've got our context, our problem. Now number 3, the solution. And solutions in political speeches tend to be really easy. It tends to be, you need to elect someone like me to do a job like that. You don't need to overthink this one. So you want people to be arriving at that conclusion on their own, but at some point you do need to state it.
I don't have anything to add.
Yeah. I have one small thought about this,
Go ahead.
which is that the only other thing to think about with the solution is, generally speaking, like when we wrote for President Obama, one of the things that I really admired about him was that he always made speeches about other people as much as possible, and about himself as little as possible. But there can be a moment, particularly in this solution section, where you can be a little bit selfish and say, we need people. You don't need to outright say, we need me, I'm the solution, but you can get pretty close to that.
Right.
In a way that in the sections we're about to talk about, maybe you want to keep things broad.
Right, and I think so that might mean we want people who have experience doing X, Y, Z, or we want people who have a background in ABC, and then the clear sort of conclusion is that you want to vote for me. Now the fourth point is visualization or a vision. So what now you want to do is say, if we do these things, if we solve the problem in the way I've suggested, which is really electing me, here's what I think our school system will look like. Here's the future I imagine. Paint a picture for people about your vision for what things will look like if they agree with what you've sort of set out.
Yeah, and this can really be as simple. I mean, the sort of cliched way to do it is to say, imagine if, and then list all those things. But that's actually fine. Yeah, like you can find a more artful way to do it, but don't waste your time if you're just like, imagine if, and here's how the world's going to be better when we change the people representing us. Great, you can do that. And the more important thing, rather than think about the rhetoric or the words or how to make it all kind of pretentious and artsy-fartsy, is figure out how to make it visual, how to make it look real. So use a specific example. Imagine a child rather than imagine all our children, because what you want is to have the audience at this moment, they should have a clear picture in their head. All right, number 5, we're almost done. So context, we had our need, we had our solution, our vision, and then finally there's a call to action. And this is really the most important part of a political speech. Without the call to action, you wouldn't be giving this speech in the first place. And it's also a chance to kind of broaden this out, right? This is the sort of I can't do it alone part of the speech.
Mm-hmm. Your call to action, you want it to be specific, and you want to make people feel like they are joining something that's bigger than you and bigger than them. They're joining a campaign, they're joining a movement of people who want to change the school system or change whatever it is you're trying to change. And so that means, join us and then give them a really specific ask. Is it to sign up? Is it to knock on doors? Is it to, put their email address down? Is it to donate? Is it to vote? But give them something concrete to do and make them feel like they're part of something that's bigger than just them or you.
And one thing I'd say about that is I think a lot of people follow the first part of your advice, the bigger than themselves thing.
Yes.
So they say, this isn't just about me, this is a movement, where everyone loves saying that this is a movement. Sometimes it's even true. But you have to then say, this is a movement, so join that movement by doing something specific. That's where a lot of people don't take your advice.
Correct.
And so to combine those two halves is really important. And you can see this even in President Obama's campaign speeches, where, these were, nobody is sort of, I think, in the last, several decades, more of a movement than the Obama campaign, but it was still, you have to vote, you have to knock every door, you have to make one more phone call, you have to, invest your time or your resources. There were specific asks, sometimes several if it was a lot of people, or if it was just one group of people, and he or a representative of his campaign knew exactly what he wanted, just say that one thing.
Yeah, and that goes to sort of the whole point of the stump speech and the message that we're talking about, which is it's not just to make people feel good, it's to make people do something. And so you have to remind them at the end to actually do something.
Yeah. So finishing a speech can be hard. I think both of us have had that experience where you're staring at the last line forever.
Yes.
But the best advice I ever got about this is just bring it back to the beginning and it'll look really fancy. It's actually a pretty easy way to look like you did something hard, is if the beginning you told your story about your 3 kids and there was some specific detail, at the end just work that detail back in and you'll get way more credit than you deserve. Don't tell anyone we told you this. One way to see something like this in action is look at President Obama's 2004 convention speech. That's what they used to teach organizers like me off of in 2008. And, if you think about it in context, right, he starts by saying, I shouldn't be here. And then he tells us about his own family background. Do you remember?
No.
Is this just going to be me
This
now?
might just be you.
All right, I'm going to be quick. Right? So then he talks about what? He talks about all the problems that America is facing. This is a big speech. He's not a local candidate in this context, but it's, all the things that he's seen, all the factories that he's seen closing, the different ways that Americans feel like they're being left behind by their government. And then he says, solution, elect John Kerry. Spoiler alert, that didn't go great. It was a good idea.
It's a great idea.
And then he does lay out this vision, right? That's the not red states or blue states, but the United States kind of thing. This idea that we can be better than we are right now. And then there's a call to action, which is specifically about how people can help the Kerry campaign. Again, spoiler alert, didn't work great. Still, that speech, and if you go back and YouTube it and watch it, if you really want to get into this, that's a perfect example of a kind of Monroe's motivated sequence speech in action. And you don't need to be on the biggest national stage to deliver something like that. You can still learn from it in any context. So it's like having the perfect, speech giving 101 textbook just on YouTube if you want it.
So when you're preparing to deliver your speech, I think the most important word there is to prepare. So once you've kind of gotten down your message, you've written down a speech, the most important thing you can do is practice it. And that means, maybe you just want to film yourself doing it with your phone. Maybe you want to get some feedback, read it to your friends, read it to your spouses and your family, and just get people's feedback and see if it resonates with them. But what you're trying to do is sort of internalize the message so that you're not just reading from a paper, but that it feels like you're really telling your story in an authentic way. And so that when you're just in an elevator with somebody and they ask you what you're doing and you say, hey, I'm running for school board, you can kind of quickly summon a minute-long version of that speech because you've internalized the message. So my most important advice is practice.
You don't need to be perfect. I think that's the point is not to prepare in order to sound like a perfect orator. The point is to prepare so that you don't forget what you're trying to say as you tell your story. Imagine just telling a story to a bunch of friends at a dinner party. You don't need to, you might need to remember the parts of the story, but people aren't expecting you to be perfect, they're expecting you to be real. And I think If you can be real and also remember your key points, then you're 90% of the way there. I think the most common mistake people make with speech writing is they sit down and start writing too quickly and they don't do enough thinking about what they really want to say. So I would advise almost anyone, start with, what's my call to action? What's the one thing I want the audience to remember if they don't remember anything else? Know the answers to that really, really well, and then start figuring out your speech. But don't sit down and say, all right, I'm going to write a speech and then figure out my call to action at the end. That's never going to go well.
I think that's right. I also think that people the mistake people make is thinking about it again like a speech, like I have to write a speech, and they're thinking I need to sound lofty and I need to have pretty rhetoric, and those things are nice, but that's not really the point of what you're trying to do. You're just trying to tell your story, you're trying to have a call to action, you're trying to leave people with something, and it's not about sounding soaring, it's not, again, like sounding like Barack Obama. That's not your goal. Keep it simple, sound like a human being, sound like a real person who's talking to somebody else in a living room.
And one other big mistake, and it's one we may have already made, but don't go on too long, because think about yourself in the audience. You have never seen a speech and thought, that was great, but if it had been 30 minutes instead of 20 minutes, I would have been even happier. Nobody has ever thought that. Even when we were writing speeches for the president, and also for the president who's the best speaker of the last many presidents, we're still working really hard to keep things short because people do lose that attention span. Tell stories of other people. We talked a lot about telling your own story, but especially after the first section of your speech. Think about who's the most inspiring volunteer you have, who's a voter you met, where that's the story that you tell other voters. A lot of the time, a really easy way to both make it clear that it's not all about you, but also to get people to feel like they're part of it, is to tell the story of someone who could be in the audience, or maybe even someone who is in the audience. That was one of my favorite parts of our old job when we were writing speeches for Obama, was to find people in the audience and figure out how the president was going to tell their stories.
That said, and I think it's really important, you always want to tell other people's stories. At the same time, don't shy away from telling your own story when you're first introducing yourself as a candidate to people. I think, especially, I work with women candidates, and especially as women, we tend to sort of shy away from tooting our own horn and sharing our accomplishments. We kind of hide behind them a little bit, and there are a whole lot of reasons for that. But in this case, because you're running for office, you need to tell people why you deserve the job, and so don't be shy about that. You're not bragging. You're telling your story so that you can serve other people, and it's important to, talk about who you are.
Yeah. Don't be funny, be warm. There's a big difference between being, you're not a comedian, just do something that's kind of warm and charming, and that will get a chuckle or a laugh or whatever. But people spend way too much time thinking about, how do I get some really good jokes into this speech? And honestly, that's not something you need to worry about nearly as much as you need to worry about the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, just be yourself. People will like you.
Yeah. Well, hopefully.
Hopefully.
The most important thing you can do with all this information is just put it to work. It seems like there's a lot here, that it's daunting, that you've got other things going on as a candidate. What I would say is make sure to take some time and think through how you're telling your story, or your stump speech, even if that's not what you're going to call it, and just see whether it's lining up with this kind of checklist and whether it's doing some of the things that we've talked about. It's worth taking that time.
So take your story and see, does it kind of flow with what we talked about? Context, problem, solution, visualization, call to action. And if you do that work on the front end, it'll make it easier on the back end when you're in these conversations to sort of quickly summon up that story and tell it in a way that's compelling. And then you're not alone. So Run for Something has mentors. There's an entire mentorship database you should look into, and if you need help, they're there to help you sort of practice and think through your story and get things down.
Yeah. And the other thing too is we're vaguely around. I'm on Twitter at David Litt.
I'm on Twitter at Sarada Peri.
So if you send us questions, we'll try to figure out a way to maybe not answer each of them one-on-one, but we'll certainly answer them in bulk, or we'll figure out which ones we get most and try to help out in the future too.
We're really excited that you're running, and good luck.
Yeah, good luck. If you are printing out your speech, don't use the bottom 4 or 5 inches of the page. Print in a bigger font than you think you're going to need. and then leave the last, again, 4 inches blank. And the reason for that is you'll see a lot of speakers read off a page and they'll say, "Hi, it's great to be here, and I'm thinking about," and then they get lost, like their chin sort of tucks into their chest and everything falls apart. This way you're only looking at the top section, so you can always look at your audience rather than sort of at your own, like into your own stomach.